The Illinois House passed a bill cracking down on threats of violence against libraries. It's an initiative from Illinois Secretary of State Alexei Janulius. The bill would treat threats against libraries like schools, making the offense a Class 4 felony. It comes after a wave of threats against libraries across Illinois, including 22 bomb threats between July and September of last year, according to the Secretary of State's office.
We think that libraries should be safe havens and shouldn't be, and that if someone's going to be making these kind of threats, they should get the same type of treatment as someone making a threat to a school.
The bill also creates a security grant program for libraries across the state.